The observation deck of the Galactic Council station buzzed with the usual morning activity as ambassador, as Zethra settled into her workstation and began reviewing the day's assignments. She was a Valkyrie, insect-like species with shimmering green exoskeleton and compound, eyes that could process information faster than most organic beings in the galaxy. Today's tasks seemed routine enough. It's just another petition from a newly spacefaring species requesting evaluation for council membership. Zethra had processed hundreds of these applications over her 40-year career, and they all followed the same predictable pattern. A primitive world discovers faster than light travel. They detect council beacon signals, they send out clumsy first contact messages, and eventually, someone like Zethra had to go evaluate whether they were civilized enough to join the galactic community. The holographic display flickered to life above her desk, showing a beautiful blue and green world spinning slowly in the void. The planet orbited an unremarkable yellow star in the outer spiral arm of the galaxy. Far from the bustling trade routes and cultural centers that made up the heart of council space, Zethra Sade, a younger Valkyrie named Shethik, approached with his datapad clutched in his smaller manipulator arms. His mandibles clicked together in what passed for amusement among their kind as he transmitted the preliminary survey data to her station. The species called themselves humans, and they called their homeworld Earth. Standard oxygen-nitrogen atmosphere. Single large moon, abundant liquid water, covering most of the surface, and a remarkable variety of climatic zones. Nothing about the planet seemed exceptional or noteworthy. The preliminary scans showed a civilization that had unified under a single, planetary government approximately 60 years ago, which was actually quite impressive. Most species took centuries to overcome their tribal divisions. They had achieved nuclear capability, developed digital communication networks, most recently had cracked the secret of faster-than-light travel, using what they called a quantum displacement drive. Zethra noted that their version of FTL was crude but functional, similar to what the Praxi Collective had developed 12,000 years ago. Zethra scrolled through the psychological profile data that the automated survey drones had compiled. Humans appeared to be a social species with strong family bonds and complex cultural traditions. They created art, music, literature, and had developed sophisticated philosophical and scientific traditions. They had a history of warfare, but so did most species before achieving planetary unity. Overall, they seemed like reasonable candidates for membership, though probably would need a few decades of cultural exchange before they could fully integrate into council society. She authorized the standard first contact protocols and assigned a diplomatic team to travel to the Sol system for initial meetings. The team would consist of herself, 2 cultural specialists, a xenobiologist, and a small security detail. Standard procedure, nothing complicated. Zethra filed her initial report and moved on to the next item on her agenda, already forgetting about the unremarkable little world called Earth. What Zethra did not know, what nobody on the council could have known, was that the automatic translation matrix was still processing humanity's linguistic database. The AI systems that handled translation between the 847 member species were incredibly sophisticated, but they were not perfect. They had to analyze not just current languages, but also historical linguistic data to understand the full context of how a species communicated. For humans, this meant processing thousands of languages, both living and dead, stretching back tens of thousands of years. Deep in the Council's central database on the archive world of Terminus 7, the translation AI was cross-referencing the human word Earth with every known linguistic database in Council records. It checked against the languages of all current member species, then against the historical records of extinct civilizations, and finally against the oldest files in the archive, the records left behind by the progenitors. The progenitors were the ancient race that had founded the original Galactic Council 8 million years ago. Long before any current member species had even evolved intelligence, they had surveyed the entire galaxy, cataloging every world, every potential threat, every resource worth noting. Then they had vanished, leaving behind only their databases and the basic framework of what would eventually become the modern Council. The translation AI found a match. and immediately several warning protocols activated. Red flags began appearing in systems that had not been accessed in millions of years. Security subroutines that existed only in the oldest code libraries suddenly came online. And somewhere in the vast bureaucracy of the Galactic Council, a file was flagged for immediate review by the Archivist Division. Meanwhile, 300 light-years away in the Sol system, Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the USS Reliance and watched history unfold before his eyes. The Reliance was humanity's first true deep space vessel. A beautiful ship that combined the best human engineering with the newly developed quantum drive that made faster than light travel possible. Jake had been an astronaut and test pilot for 20 years before being selected to command humanity's first diplomatic mission to the stars. He was a calm, thoughtful man in his mid-40s with graying hair, and the kind of steady presence that inspired confidence in his crew. Beside him, his first officer, Lieutenant Commander Lisa Brady, monitored the sensor displays with intense focus. Lisa was brilliant, a former astrophysicist who had transitioned to military service when humanity began its expansion into space. She had dark hair pulled back in a tight bun and sharp green eyes that missed nothing. Right now, those eyes were fixed on the 3 alien vessels that had just appeared at the edge of the solar system. Their exotic energy signatures, unlike anything human sensors had ever detected before. The moment humanity had dreamed about for centuries had finally arrived. They were not alone in the universe. The radio signals that Earth's telescopes had detected 5 years ago had been real, not some natural phenomenon or instrument error. There were other intelligent species out there, and they were coming to meet humanity. Jake took a deep breath and straightened his uniform. He had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in simulations, but nothing could truly prepare someone for the reality of first contact. His hands were steady as he gripped the armrests of his command chair, but inside his heart was racing. This was bigger than him, bigger than his crew, bigger than any single human accomplishment in history. This was humanity stepping onto the galactic stage for the first time. The communication console chirped, and the officer manning it looked up with wide eyes, barely able to contain his excitement as he reported that the alien vessels were broadcasting on standard radio frequencies. It's clearly attempting to establish contact. Jake nodded and gave the order to open a channel. The view screen flickered and then resolved into a clear image of Ambassador Zethra. The alien's insectoid features were startling, but her posture seemed non-threatening and the translation software worked smoothly, converting her chittering vocalizations into perfect English. "Greetings, Captain Morrison." The translator rendered her words. "I am Ambassador Zethra of the Galactic Council, and I come in peace to evaluate your species for potential membership in our alliance." Jake felt a surge of emotion, but kept his voice professional and warm as he responded. "Welcome to our solar system, Ambassador. We are deeply honored by your visit and eager to learn about the greater galaxy and our place within it." As the diplomatic exchange continued, and both sides exchanged pleasantries and basic information, none of them realized that, far away in the council archives, Archivist Nathala of the Preeth Collective was staring at her screen in absolute horror. Her forearms trembled as she read and reread the ancient file that had just appeared on her display. The file that explained exactly what Earth really was, and why the progenitors had marked it as the most dangerous world in the entire galaxy. Archivist Nathala had worked in the council archives for 70 years, and she had never seen anything like this. Her forearms moved frantically across her workstation as she tried to understand what she was looking at. The file that had appeared on her screen was written in Old Council Standard, a language so ancient that only a handful of scholars in the entire galaxy could still read it fluently. Fortunately, Nathala was one of those scholars. The Preeth were a species devoted to knowledge and history. She had spent decades studying the records left behind by the progenitors. But she had never seen this particular file before because it had been buried deep in the forbidden archives, protected by security protocols that required multiple trigger conditions to unlock the human word. Earth had triggered those protocols. More specifically, Translation Matrix had finally completed its deep analysis of human linguistic history and had found connections that went far beyond simple vocabulary. The AI had traced the word through dozens of human languages, both living and dead, finding variations in root words that stretched back to the very beginning of human civilization. And then it had found something that made the ancient security systems wake up. The humans had other names for their world, names buried in mythology and ancient texts. Terra, Gaia, Midgard, and dozens more. But there was one name that appeared in fragments across multiple dead human languages, a name that seemed to describe not what the planet was called, but what it represented. The progenitor file translated that name as the Forge, and Nethala felt her blood run cold as she read the full designation. Planet classification, Class 12 hazard world, species designation, Deathworlders, common name among elder races, the Shatterpoint, the Forge of Monsters, the world that should not be. The file was dated 8 million years ago, filed by a progenitor survey team that had visited Earth long before humans had even evolved. They had cataloged the planet in excruciating detail, and their assessment was terrifying in its clinical precision. Nethala read through the environmental data with growing disbelief. Earth's gravity was measured at 9.8 meters per second squared, nearly 40% higher than the galactic standard of 7.0. Most council species evolved on worlds with gentler gravity, and even the heavy worlders rarely exceeded 8.5. The atmospheric composition was listed as 21% oxygen. Nethala had to check that number 3 times because it seemed impossible. The galactic standard was 12%, and anything above 15 was considered dangerously flammable. Earth's atmosphere was so oxygen-rich that it would be toxic to more than half of all known species. Lightning strikes would be far more intense, fires would burn hotter and faster, and any species breathing that air would need incredibly efficient metabolisms just to handle the oxidative stress. The temperature ranges were equally extreme. Earth experienced seasonal variations that ranged from -40 degrees Celsius to +50 degrees Celsius in different regions, with some areas even more extreme. Galactic standard for habitable worlds was a narrow band between 10 and 30 degrees, with minimal variation. Earth's weather patterns included cyclonic storms with wind speeds exceeding 250 kilometers per hour. And the progenitor report noted dryly that such storms occurred regularly and were considered normal by the planet's ecosystem. The tectonic activity was classified as hyperactive, with thousands of earthquakes occurring daily and hundreds of active volcanic systems. The radiation exposure from the local star was 30% higher than galactic standard, meaning any species living there would need robust DNA repair mechanisms just to survive. But the environmental hazards were only the beginning. Nethala scrolled down to the biological assessment section and felt her hearts begin to race. Earth was what the progenitors called a competition world, a rare type of planet where the evolutionary pressure was so intense that it produced ecosystems of staggering complexity and danger. The report listed dozens of apex predators, creatures that had evolved to be perfect killing machines in their respective environments. There were pack hunters with sophisticated social structures and tactical coordination. There were ambush predators with reflexes fast enough to snatch prey out of the air. There were persistence hunters that could track prey for days without rest. And that was just on land. The oceans contained creatures even more terrifying, and the skies were filled with aerial predators that could spot small prey from kilometers away. The progenitors had paid special attention to the primates, the family of species that would eventually give rise to humans. Even 8 million years ago, the report noted that these creatures showed remarkable intelligence and adaptability. They used tools, they lived in complex social groups, they could adapt to almost any environment on the planet. The progenitor biologists had run predictive models on what might happen if these primates continued to evolve under Earth's harsh conditions. The models all reached the same conclusion. If a technological species ever emerged from this world, it would be dangerous beyond measure, not because they would be evil or malicious, the report carefully noted, but because they would be capable. They would have physical abilities far beyond galactic norms because they evolved in high gravity. They would have incredible endurance because their oxygen-rich atmosphere allowed for extremely efficient metabolism. Systems because Earth's hyperactive biosphere was filled with diseases and parasites. They would heal quickly from injuries because anything less would be evolutionary suicide on such a dangerous world. They would be able to function in environmental extremes that would kill most species. And most dangerously, they would have minds shaped by constant competition and challenge. Minds that could innovate and adapt and overcome obstacles through sheer determination. The progenitor recommendation was stark and unambiguous. This world should be quarantined indefinitely. No contact should ever be established with any species that might evolve here. If a technological civilization does emerge, they must be contained within their own star system by any means necessary. The report concluded with a chilling note. A species from this world would not need to be hostile to be an existential threat to galactic civilization. Their very existence would destabilize the careful balance we have maintained. It would outcompete other species, not through malice, but through simple capability. They would spread across the galaxy like wildfire, not because they seek conquest, but because nothing would be able to stop them. Nethala sat back in her chair, her forearms trembling. The humans were here. They had achieved spaceflight, and Ambassador Zethra was in their star system right now, conducting a standard first contact evaluation as if they were just another species requesting membership. Zethra had no idea what she was dealing with. None of them did. The humans seemed peaceful and friendly in their communications, but that was exactly what made them so dangerous. They did not know they were dangerous. They thought their world was normal. They thought they were normal. She pulled up the comparative data that the Council's own sensors had gathered during the preliminary survey. Human physiology showed bone density 40% higher than galactic average, muscle fiber efficiency off the charts, and a cardiovascular system that could operate at incredible performance levels. They could survive injuries that would kill most species outright, could go without food for weeks and without water for days. It could function in temperature extremes from freezing to desert heat. It could run for hours without stopping. A trait called persistence hunting that was almost unheard of in the galaxy. In their brains, their incredible brains that had evolved to solve problems and imagine solutions and cooperating groups to overcome challenges that would be impossible for individuals. Nethala knew she had to act immediately. She initiated an emergency session of the full Galactic Council, invoking the progenitor protocols that had not been used in recorded history. Within minutes, her request was approved, and notifications went out to all 847 member species. The Council would convene in 6 hours, and Nethala would have to explain to them that they had made a terrible mistake. They had invited the Deathworlders to join them, and now they would have to decide what to do about it. The Grand Council chamber was a massive spherical room that could hold representatives from all 847 member species simultaneously. It floated in the center of Council Station Prime, space habitat that had existed for over 3 million years and served as the political heart of galactic civilization. The chamber's walls were transparent, offering a breathtaking view of the stars beyond, and the seating was arranged in concentric rings that accommodated every possible form of intelligent life. There were water-filled tanks for aquatic species, methane atmosphere bubbles for those who breathed different gases, low-gravity platforms for fragile species, and high-gravity sections for the heavy dashworlders. Right now, every single seat was filled. The emergency session had drawn representatives from across known space, many of them arriving via quantum communication rather than traveling in person. Holographic projections mixed with physical attendees, creating a dazzling display of galactic diversity. There were crystalline beings that communicated through light patterns, gaseous entities contained in force fields, insectoid species like the Velkari, reptilian races, mammalian species, and forms so alien that they defied easy categorization. All of them had come because Archivist Nethala had invoked the progenitor protocols, something that had never happened in the entire recorded history of the modern council. Ambassador Zethra stood in one of the lower rings, her confusion evident in the agitated clicking of her mandibles. She had been recalled from the Sol system immediately, ordered to break off all contact with the humans, and return to council space without explanation. The humans had been bewildered by the sudden change, and Captain Morrison had sent several messages asking if they had done something wrong. Zethra had not known how to answer because she herself had no idea what was happening. The humans had been perfectly pleasant during their initial meetings, curious and eager to learn, but also respectful and diplomatic.
Elsie.
She had been preparing to file a positive preliminary report when the recall order came. The chairbean called the session to order, its gaseous form pulsing with colors that the translation matrix rendered as formal speech. The emergency protocols have been invoked by archivist Nethala of the Preeth Collective. She will now present her findings to this assembled council. Archivist, you may proceed. Nethala's projection appeared at the center of the chamber where everyone could see her clearly. Her forearms clutched her data tablets tightly, and her voice trembled slightly as she began to speak. Honored representatives, I have called you here because we have made a critical error in judgment. The species we know as humans, the ones currently waiting in the Sol system for our response to their membership application, come from a world that the progenitors classified as the single most dangerous planet in the surveyed galaxy. A wave of shocked murmurs rippled through the chamber. Several representatives began speaking at once, their various forms of communication creating a cacophony that the translation system struggled to manage. The chair being pulsed for silence and order was gradually restored. Nethala continued, her voice stronger now. The planet they call Earth is designated in progenitor records as a Class 12 hazard world. To put that in perspective, there are only 17 Class 12 worlds known to exist in the entire galaxy. And Earth is the only one that has produced a technological civilization. The progenitors recommended permanent quarantine, specifically warned against any contact with species that might evolve there. She displayed the ancient report for all to see, and the chamber fell silent as the representatives absorbed the data. The environmental specifications alone were shocking. Many species present could not survive even brief exposure to Earth's conditions. The gravity would crush some of them, the oxygen would poison others, and the weather would be catastrophic for nearly everyone. But Ambassador Zethra found her voice and spoke up. Archivist, I have spent 3 weeks in communication with these humans. They are peaceful, curious, and remarkably similar to many species already in the Council. Yes, their world is harsh by our standards, but they pose no obvious threat. Their technology is advanced, but not dangerous. Their culture values cooperation and knowledge. What exactly are we afraid of? We are afraid of what they can do without even trying, Nethala replied. She brought up new data, comparative physiology charts that showed human capabilities next to galactic norms. Look at this. Humans can survive injuries that would be fatal to 80% of Council species. Their bones are dense enough to support structures in high gravity. Their muscles can operate at efficiency levels we consider impossible. They can run for hours without stopping. A trait called persistence hunting that evolved because their prey would literally die of exhaustion before the humans gave up the chase. A reptilian representative from the Saurian Confederacy spoke up, his translated words sharp with skepticism. Archivist, being physically robust does not make them dangerous. We have heavy worlder species in the Council already. The Krell from Terminus Prime live in gravity 1.4 times standard. They are strong and resilient, yet they are peaceful members of our community. Ambassador Krell himself spoke from his section of the chamber, his massive form barely fitting in the reinforced seating designed for his kind. The Saurian makes a fair point. I have reviewed the data on these humans, and yes, they are impressive physically. But I am also impressive compared to most of you, and I have never been considered a threat. What makes humans different? Nethala took a deep breath. What makes them different is that they do not know they are different. Ambassador Zethra, during your communications with the humans, did they ever mention that their world was unusually dangerous? Did they express any awareness that their physical capabilities were exceptional? Zethra's mandibles clicked thoughtfully. No, they spoke of Earth as if it were perfectly normal. Captain Morrison mentioned their weather systems casually, as if hurricanes with 300-kilometer-per-hour winds were just a minor inconvenience. He talked about their history of exploration, how humans had climbed the highest mountains and crossed the deadliest deserts, just because they wanted to see what was there. Exactly, Nethala said. They think this is normal. They evolved in a crucible of constant challenge and competition, and it shaped every aspect of who they are. The progenitor psychological assessment predicted that any species from Earth would have what they called an unstoppable drive. Not aggression, not hostility, just an inability to accept limits. When a human encounters an obstacle, their first instinct is not to go around it or accept it. Their instinct is to overcome it, to break through it, to find a solution no matter how impossible it seems. She displayed more data this time, showing human history. Look at their technological development. They went from primitive agriculture to spaceflight in less than 10,000 years. They went from first controlled flight to landing on their moon in 66 years. They nearly destroyed themselves with nuclear weapons, and instead of stepping back from the technology, they found ways to control it and use it peacefully. They faced a global pandemic that killed millions, and they developed multiple effective vaccines in less than a year. Every time they face extinction, they innovate their way out of it. The chamber was silent now, representatives beginning to understand the scope of what they were dealing with. A jellyfish-like being from the Luminari cluster pulsed with agitated colors. So what are you proposing, Archivist? That we reject their membership application? That we quarantine them in their own system, as the progenitors recommended? Nathala's forearms spread in a gesture of uncertainty. I do not know. The progenitor protocols were never designed for this situation. They assumed the quarantine would hold forever. The humans would never develop spaceflight on their own. But they did, and now they know we exist. We have already made contact. We cannot simply pretend they do not exist. Then what can we do? The Cherubing asked. If they are as capable as you suggest, attempting to contain them could be seen as an act of war. And if they are as persistent as the progenitor report indicates, they would eventually break any containment we tried to impose. Ambassador Krell spoke again, his deep voice rumbling through the translation system. I propose an alternative. We tell them the truth. We show them the progenitor report. We explain why we are concerned. And then we give them the chance to prove us wrong. The humans claim to value peace and cooperation. Let us see if they can live up to those values when they know we fear them. Several representatives objected immediately, their various forms of communication creating another wave of chaos. The Cherubing pulsed for order once more. Ambassador Krell's suggestion has merit, but it is also dangerous. If we tell the humans that we fear them, we might create the very threat we are trying to avoid. A species that knows it is feared might become aggressive out of self-defense. Or, new voice spoke up, they might understand our concerns and work to address them. The speaker was Ambassador Lyra, a graceful being from the Celestial Chorus, species known for their diplomatic skills and empathetic abilities. I have reviewed the human cultural databases. They have extensive literature about first contact scenarios, and many of their stories explore exactly this situation. They have thought about how they would react if other species feared them. Perhaps we should trust in their intelligence and their stated values. The debate continued for hours, with representatives arguing passionately on all sides. Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the USS Reliance and tried not to show his frustration. 3 days had passed since Ambassador Zethra and her delegation had suddenly departed without explanation. 3 days of silence from the Galactic Council, despite multiple attempts at communication. 3 days of his crew asking questions he could not answer. Something had gone wrong, that much was obvious, but Jake had no idea what it could be. Every interaction with the council representatives had been positive. The cultural exchanges had gone smoothly. The technical demonstrations had impressed the aliens. There had been no conflicts, no misunderstandings, no incidents that could explain this sudden cold shoulder. Lisa Brady approached from her station, her expression concerned. Captain, I just received a priority message from Earth. The United Nations Security Council is demanding answers. They want to know why the aliens left and whether we did something to offend them. There are protests breaking out in major cities. People are scared that first contact has failed before it even really began. Jake rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of representing the entire human species pressing down on him. Tell them we are doing everything we can to reestablish communication. Tell them we have not given up. Before Lisa could respond, The communication console came alive with an incoming transmission. But it was not from the council delegation. It was a tight beam encrypted signal coming from deep space, and the origin codes indicated it was from someone using unofficial channels. Lieutenant Daniel Hayes, their communication specialist, looked up with surprise. "Sir, this is strange. Someone is trying to contact us outside official council channels?" The encryption is sophisticated, but they included translation protocols. They want to talk to us privately. Jake exchanged glances with Lisa. This could be a trap. But it could also be their only chance to find out what was happening. Put it through, but keep the CH. Anil isolated. I want to know who we are talking to before we share any information. The view screen flickered and resolved into the image of Archivist Nethala. Her forearms were folded in what human cultural experts had identified as a gesture of respect among the Preeth species. "Captain Morrison, I am contacting you against the advice of many in the council because I believe you deserve to know the truth. What I am about to tell you will be difficult to hear, but I hope you will understand that it comes from a place of concern rather than hostility." Jake felt his pulse quicken, but kept his voice calm. "We appreciate any information you can provide, Archivist. We have been confused by the sudden silence from your delegation." Nethala's image seemed to hesitate, and then she began transmitting data. "Captain, your world Earth appears in our oldest records under a different designation. The progenitors, an ancient race that existed millions of years before any current council species, surveyed your planet long ago. They classified it as what they called a Class 12 hazard world and recommended that it be quarantined permanently. When our translation systems finally processed your full linguistic database, they triggered security protocols that have not been activated in recorded history." Jake listened as Nathila explained the progenitor report in detail. He heard about the environmental classifications, the biological assessments, the predictions about what kind of species would evolve on such a dangerous world. He saw the comparative data showing how Earth's gravity, atmosphere, and weather patterns compared to galactic norms. He learned that most council species would consider his homeworld a literal death trap, unsurvivable without extensive protective equipment. Lisa stood beside him, her face growing pale as she absorbed the information. Daniel had stopped working entirely and was staring at the screen in disbelief. Around the bridge, other crew members who could hear the conversation had similar expressions of shock. When Nethala finished, Jake was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked the question that mattered most. "Archivist, does the council believe we are a threat?" Nethala's forearms spread in that gesture of uncertainty. "The council is divided. Some believe you are dangerous simply by existing. Others think you should be given a chance to prove your peaceful intentions. A few extremists are calling for your system to be blockaded to prevent you from expanding into the galaxy. That is why I contacted you privately. I believe you have the right to know what you are facing and the right to defend yourselves before the council makes any decisions." Jake took a deep breath and looked around his bridge at his crew. These were good people, scientists and explorers, and diplomats who had dedicated their lives to the dream of meeting other intelligent species. The idea that the galaxy feared them, that Earth was seen as some kind of monster factory, was almost too absurd to process. But he could see from the data that Nethala was not lying or exaggerating. By galactic standards, Earth really was an incredibly dangerous place, and humans really were physically exceptional. "Archivist Nethala," Jake said carefully. "We had no idea our world was unusual. To us, Earth is just home. We evolved there, we adapted to its conditions, and we never thought of ourselves as particularly special or dangerous. We are explorers and scientists. We came to the stars seeking friendship and knowledge, not conquest or conflict." "I believe you, Captain," Nethala replied. "But belief is not enough for the Council. They will want proof. They will want assurances. And some of them will not be satisfied with anything less than your complete isolation." "Then we need to speak to them directly," Jake said with sudden determination. "We need the chance to address the full Council and explain who we really are. It's not what some ancient report says we might be, but who we have actually chosen to become. Can you arrange that?" Nethala was silent for a moment. It would be highly irregular. The Council does not normally allow species under evaluation to address them directly, but these are unusual circumstances. Let me see what I can do. In the meantime, Captain, I suggest you prepare carefully. You will be speaking not just for yourself or your crew, but for your entire species. The future of humanity's relationship with the galaxy may depend on what you say. The transmission ended, and Jake turned to face his crew. They were all looking at him with a mixture of fear, confusion, and hope. He knew he needed to say something to reassure them, to give them confidence that this situation could still be salvaged. But what could he say when he was just as uncertain as they were? Lisa spoke first, her voice steady, despite everything. Captain, we should contact Earth immediately. The government needs to know what we are dealing with. They need to prepare statements, gather evidence of our peaceful intentions, maybe even send additional representatives. Jake nodded. You are right. Open a priority channel to the UN headquarters. And get me every member of our diplomatic team. We need to craft a message that will convince an entire galaxy that humans are not the monsters they fear we might be. Over the next 18 hours, the crew of the Reliance worked frantically to prepare. They compiled humanity's history of cooperation and peace. They gathered examples of human compassion and sacrifice. They assembled data on Earth's united government and the decades of work it had taken to overcome humanity's own violent past. They prepared presentations showing human art, music, literature, and philosophy. They wanted to show the Council not just that humans could be peaceful, but that humans had actively chosen peace, even when violence would have been easier. Jake barely slept during this time. He reviewed every word of the speech he was preparing, trying to find the right balance between acknowledging the Council's concerns and defending humanity's character. He knew he could not lie or minimize the truth. The data about Earth's environment and human capabilities was irrefutable. But he could try to make the Council understand that capability was not the same as intent. That being able to do something did not mean you would do it. Finally, word came from Nathala. The Council had agreed to hear from humanity. They would convene a special session where Captain Morrison and his senior officers would be allowed to address the full assembly. It was an unprecedented opportunity, but also an enormous risk. If Jake failed to convince them, if his words somehow confirmed their worst fears instead of alleviating them, it could doom humanity to isolation or worse. The day of the hearing arrived, and Jake put on his dress uniform with shaking hands. Lisa and Daniel would accompany him, appearing via holographic projection to the Council chamber on the distant station. The three of them stood together on the bridge, surrounded by their crew, prepared to make the most important argument in human history. The holographic projection materialized in the center of the Grand Council chamber, and Jake Morrison found himself standing before nearly 1,000 alien species. The sight was overwhelming, even though he had prepared himself mentally for this moment. Beings of every imaginable shape and form filled the tiered seating that surrounded him. Some were recognizable as living creatures, while others seemed more like forces of nature contained in technological shells. The sheer diversity of life in the galaxy was breathtaking and terrifying in equal measure. Jake could feel the weight of their attention. Thousands of alien eyes and sensors and consciousness fields all focused on him and his two companions. Lisa stood to his right, her posture military straight, but her hands clasped behind her back to hide their trembling. Daniel was on his left, his usually cheerful face set in serious lines. The three of them represented not just humanity but Earth itself, and the responsibility felt crushing. Jake took a deep breath and reminded himself that he had faced dangerous situations before. He had piloted experimental spacecraft through situations that should have killed him. He had made split-second decisions that saved lives. He could do this. The chair being's translated voice boomed through the chamber. Captain Morrison of Earth, you have requested the opportunity to address this council regarding your species and your world. We have granted this unprecedented hearing because the circumstances are equally unprecedented. You may speak, Jake stepped forward slightly and began. Honored members of the Galactic Council, I stand before you today as a representative of humanity, but more importantly, as a representative of truth. We have learned that our world Earth appears in your ancient records as a dangerous place. A world that should have been quarantined. A planet that produces what you call death worlders. I will not insult your intelligence by denying the facts. Earth is a harsh world by your standards. The gravity is high, the oxygen is rich, the weather is violent, and life there is competitive in ways that must seem frightening to species from gentler worlds. He paused and looked around the chamber, making eye contact with as many representatives as the holographic projection would allow. But I ask you to consider what those facts actually mean. Yes, we evolved in difficult conditions. Yes, those conditions shaped us into beings with physical capabilities that exceed galactic norms. But those same conditions also taught us things that I believe are valuable. We learned cooperation because no individual, human, can survive alone on Earth. We learned compassion because caring for the sick and injured made our community stronger. We learned innovation because every challenge we faced required creative solutions. And we learned peace because the alternative was extinction. A ripple of skeptical sounds moved through the chamber, and Jake knew he had to address their doubts directly. I know some of you are thinking that our history of warfare proves we are violent by nature. You have access to our databases, and you know that humans have fought terrible wars against each other. Millions have died in conflicts over resources, territory, ideology, and religion. We have created weapons capable of destroying our entire world, and we came frighteningly close to using them. I will not hide that history or pretend it did not happen. But Gate continued with more force in his voice. I ask you to also consider what came after. We created those weapons, and then we chose not to use them. We stood at the brink of nuclear war, and we stepped back. We negotiated treaties that limited those weapons. We built international organizations dedicated to preventing conflict. We slowly and painfully learned that cooperation served us better than competition. It took us thousands of years, yes, but we learned. And when we finally achieved global unity 60 years ago, it was not because we conquered each other, but because we chose to work together. Lisa stepped forward to speak next. Her voice was clear and steady as she addressed the council. Honored representatives, I am a scientist, and I believe in examining evidence without bias. So let me present you with some evidence about humanity that may not be in your ancient reports. When humans discovered we were not alone in the universe, our first instinct was joy, not fear. When we detected your beacon signals 5 years ago, there were celebrations in every city on Earth. We did not immediately begin building weapons or fortifying our borders. We built this ship, the Reliance, designed specifically for peaceful exploration and diplomacy. We sent our best people, our brightest minds, not to conquer, but to learn. She gestured, and a holographic display appeared, showing images from Earth. These are our cities, she said. Notice that they are not militarized fortresses. These are our schools where we teach our children to value knowledge and compassion. These are our hospitals where we heal the sick, regardless of their ability to pay. These are our nature preserves where we protect other species from extinction. These are our art museums and concert halls where we celebrate beauty and creativity. Do these look like the works of monsters? Daniel spoke next, his expertise in culture and history giving weight to his words. The progenitor report suggests that we are dangerous because we do not know we are dangerous, because we think our world is normal. That is true. We did think Earth was normal because it is all we have ever known. But now we know the truth. We know that our world is unusual and that we are physically exceptional by galactic standards. Does that change who we are? Does learning that we are strong make us bullies? Does discovering that we are resilient make us cruel? He shook his head firmly. We are still the same people we were before we read that ancient report. We are still explorers and scientists and artists and dreamers. The only thing that has changed is our understanding of how we compare to others. And that understanding makes us more careful, not less. Now that we know our strength, we can be more mindful of how we use it. Now that we know our world is harsh, we can better appreciate the gentler worlds you come from. Knowledge does not corrupt character. It refines it. Ambassador Zethra spoke from her position in the chamber, her mandibles clicking thoughtfully. Captain Morrison, I have spent time with you and your crew, and I believe you are sincere in your peaceful intentions. But the Council's concern is not about individuals. It is about your entire species across generations. How can you guarantee that future humans will share your values? How can you promise that in 100 years or 1,000 years, humanity will not become the threat that the progenitors predicted? Jake nodded, acknowledging the validity of her question. Ambassador Zethra, that is exactly the right question to ask. And my answer is this: we cannot guarantee the future any more than any species can. We cannot promise that every human for all time will make the right choices. What we can promise is that we will build systems and institutions designed to preserve peace and cooperation. We can promise that we will teach our children the values we hold dear. We can promise that we will hold ourselves accountable to the standards of this council. But more than that, Jake continued with growing passion, we can promise that if you give us this chance, if you accept us into the galactic community, we will work every day to prove we are worthy of that trust. We will contribute to Council's society. We will share our knowledge and learn from yours. We will defend the weak and protect the innocent. Not because we are trying to overcome our dangerous nature, but because that is who we genuinely want to be. Ambassador Krell rose from his seat, his massive form drawing attention from across the chamber. I have been listening carefully to these humans, and I have made a decision. I support their admission to the council, not as a risk to be managed, but as a potential asset to be welcomed. The progenitors were wise, but they were not infallible. They predicted that Deathworlders would be dangerous, and they were correct. But danger and threat are not the same thing. A firefighter is dangerous because they run into burning buildings, but we do not fear firefighters because we understand they use their capabilities for good. He gestured toward the human representatives. These humans come from a world that forged them into capable beings. That capability could be threatening if misused, but it could also be invaluable if directed toward protecting the galaxy rather than conquering it. I propose that we not only accept humanity into the Council, but that we invite them to join our defense forces. Let them use their strength to protect those who cannot. Protect themselves. The chamber erupted in debate with representatives arguing passionately on all sides. Some agreed with Krell, while others insisted that accepting humans was too dangerous. The chair-bing pulsed for order repeatedly, and gradually, the chaos subsided. The debate continued for hours with Jake and his officers answering question after question about human history, culture, biology, and intentions. Finally, as the debate began to wind down, the chair-bing called for a vote. All representatives in favor of granting provisional membership to humanity indicate now. The chamber filled with lights and sounds and other signals as the representatives cast their votes. The counting took several minutes while Jake stood with his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst from his chest. The vote is decided, the chair-bing announced, by a margin of 612 in favor to 235 against. With abstentions not affecting the outcome, the Galactic Council grants provisional membership to humanity of Earth. Jake felt. Lisa grabbed his arm in excitement while Daniel let out a breath he had been holding for what seemed like hours. The holographic projection flickered slightly as emotions overwhelmed the human. Crew members back on the Reliance, the chair-bing continued outlining the conditions of membership. Earth would be monitored. Human expansion would be coordinated with Council space traffic control, and humanity would participate in Council defense forces. The terms were strict but fair. Jake accepted them immediately on behalf of his species. As the transmission ended and the holographic projections faded, Jake found himself back on the bridge of the Reliance, surrounded by his cheering crew. They had done it. Against all odds, despite the fears of an entire galaxy, humanity had earned its place among the stars.